The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time that week. 23 years of service to the Crown had taught him many things, but nothing had prepared him for the chaos that modern tourism brought to his doorstep. James stood at his post, rifle at his side, eyes scanning the growing crowd of visitors. The familiar weight of his bearskin hat pressed down on his head, a reminder of the centuries of tradition he carried on his shoulders. At 45 years old, his weathered face showed the strain of countless hours standing motionless, enduring everything from scorching heat to freezing rain. The first tour bus of the day rumbled through the gates, disgorging its contents like a colorful flood. Camera flashes began immediately, followed by the inevitable attempts to make the guards react. James had seen it all before, people jumping in front of him, making silly faces, even trying to touch his uniform. A middle-aged woman with a thick American accent pushed through the crowd, her phone held high. "Oh my God, look at this one. He's so serious," she squealed to her companion. She stepped closer, well beyond the rope barriers that marked the safe distance. James kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, his training kicking in automatically. Don't react. Don't acknowledge. Maintain the dignity of the crown. The words echoed in his mind like a mantra he'd repeated thousands of times. But the woman wasn't finished. She waved her hand directly in front of his face, trying to get a reaction for her social media video. "Hello? Can you see me? Do you ever smile?" Behind her, a group of teenagers had started a game of seeing who could get closest to the guard without being stopped. They inched forward, giggling and pushing each other, their phones recording every moment. James felt his jaw tighten slightly, the only outward sign of his growing frustration. In his peripheral vision, he could see his fellow guards dealing with similar situations. This had become the new normal, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. The crowd grew larger as the morning progressed. Tour guides led groups past the guards, explaining their role and history, but their words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Most visitors were more interested in getting the perfect selfie than learning about the tradition they were witnessing. A young man in his 20s approached next, his confidence obvious in his swagger. He'd clearly been drinking, despite the early hour. "Bet you I can make this guy move," he announced loudly to his friends, who gathered around with their cameras ready. He started with verbal taunts, calling out jokes and insults, trying to provoke a response. When that failed, he began making exaggerated gestures, pretending to march like a soldier in a mocking parade around James's position. James felt his heart rate increase, but his training held firm. He'd endured worse than this. Much worse. During his service in Afghanistan, before joining the ceremonial guard, he'd faced real danger. This was just another test of his discipline and professionalism. But the drunk man wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and began filming himself as he narrated his brave confrontation with the robot soldier. His voice grew louder and more obnoxious with each passing minute. "Look at this guy. He's like a statue. I bet he doesn't even have feelings." The man laughed at his own joke, encouraged by the growing crowd of onlookers who had stopped to watch the spectacle. Other tourists began joining in, seeing an opportunity for entertainment. Someone suggested trying to make the guard blink. Another person wondered aloud if the guards were even real people or just very realistic mannequins. James's mind wandered briefly to his daughter, Emily, who was the same age as Princess Charlotte. She'd often asked him about his work, fascinated by the idea that her father protected real royalty. He tried to explain the honor and responsibility of his position, but she was too young to fully understand the weight of tradition he carried. The drunk man grew bolder, stepping even closer. The other guards remained motionless, trusting that James could handle the situation within the bounds of protocol. But protocol had its limits, and those limits were being tested more and more each day. A security guard in civilian clothes began making his way through the crowd, but progress was slow. The mass of tourists had created a bottleneck, everyone trying to get their own photos and videos of the harassment. James thought about the old days, when visitors showed more respect. His grandfather had served as a royal guard decades earlier, and the stories he'd told were different. People used to view the guards with reverence, understanding that they witnessed something special and historic. Now, social media had changed everything. Everyone wanted their moment of viral fame, and the stoic guards had become unwilling participants in countless videos and photos shared around the world. The institution that was meant to honor tradition had become a backdrop for entertainment. The drunk man reached into his backpack and pulled out what appeared to be a small toy, a rubber chicken. "Let's see if this gets a reaction," he announced, waving it in front of James's face. The crowd laughed and cheered him on. Several people started live-streaming the scene, broadcasting it to audiences around the world. James could hear the notifications pinging on various phones as likes and shares began accumulating. He felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. This wasn't what he'd signed up for when he'd taken the oath to serve the crown with dignity and honor. The ceremony and tradition that meant everything to him had been reduced to a circus act for strangers' amusement. The security guard was getting closer, but another wave of tourists from a second bus began flooding the area. The situation was quickly spiraling out of control, and James knew that standard protocol might not be enough to maintain order. His fellow guards remained perfectly still, but he could sense their tension. They were all thinking the same thing: when would enough be enough? How far could they let this go before the dignity of their position was completely compromised? The drunk man began making even more outrageous gestures with his rubber chicken, bouncing it off James's chest and pretending to have conversations with it. The crowd's laughter grew louder, and more people pressed forward to get a better view. James closed his eyes for just a moment, a tiny break in protocol that no one noticed except himself. In that brief darkness, he thought about his oath, his family, and his breaking point that felt closer than ever before. When he opened his eyes, the drunk man was reaching toward his rifle, still filming himself. That's when James knew that today would be different from all the others. The line was about to be crossed, and, for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if his training would be enough to keep him from reacting. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows, but the real shadows were the ones gathering in James's mind as he prepared for whatever would come next in what was supposed to be just another ordinary day of service to the crown. In the distance, unbeknownst to James or the unruly crowd, Princess Charlotte was making her way through the castle corridors for what she thought would be a routine visit. She had no idea that her morning walk would soon intersect with one of the most challenging moments of a dedicated soldier's career. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of duty, patience, and human dignity, with the eyes of the world watching through countless smartphone cameras, ready to capture whatever happened next in the ancient halls of Windsor Castle. James took a deep breath and prepared himself for what felt like the longest day of his 23-year career, not knowing that salvation might come from the most unexpected source of all. The drunk man's hand hovered dangerously close to James's rifle, his phone still recording everything. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people, all pressed forward to witness what they expected would be an entertaining reaction. James felt his muscles tense involuntarily as years of military training warred with his duty to remain motionless. "Don't touch the weapon," he said quietly, his voice barely audible but carrying the weight of absolute authority. It was the first time he'd spoken to a tourist in months, and the break in protocol sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd. The drunk man grinned widely. "Oh, he speaks. Say something else, soldier boy." He waved the rubber chicken more aggressively, nearly hitting James in the face. Behind the main troublemaker, the crowd had begun to fragment into different groups, each with their own agenda. A family with small children had moved to the back, clearly uncomfortable with the aggressive atmosphere. But, closer to the front, several young adults were encouraging the drunk man, treating the whole scene like free entertainment. A woman in her 30s pushed forward with her teenage daughter. "Get closer, Megan. Get a selfie with him," she instructed, completely ignoring the clearly marked boundaries and the obvious tension in the situation. The teenage girl looked embarrassed. "Mom, I don't think we should." "Oh, nonsense. We paid good money for this tour. Get the picture." James watched the family dynamic unfold, reminded once again of his own daughter. The thought of Emily being in a situation like this, being pushed to disrespect someone for a photo, made his anger burn hotter in his chest. The civilian security guard finally pushed through the crowd, his radio crackling with urgent communications. Alright, folks, we need to maintain the proper distance. Please step back behind the barriers. But his authority meant little to the drunk man, who had found an audience and wasn't ready to give up his moment in the spotlight. We're not touching him. We're just having a bit of fun. Sir, you need to step back immediately, the security guard insisted, but his tone was more pleading than commanding. The drunk man laughed. What are you going to do about it? Arrest me for standing here? He took another step closer to James, now well within arm's reach. James's training kicked into high gear. Every instinct screamed at him to either retreat or defend himself, but neither option was available. He was trapped in a bubble of protocol that felt increasingly suffocating with each passing moment. More tourists arrived, drawn by the commotion. The scene had taken on a carnival atmosphere, with people pushing and shoving to get better positions for their cameras. Someone in the back started a slow clap, encouraging the drunk man to escalate his behavior even further. An elderly gentleman with a military bearing pushed through the crowd, his face red with anger. This is absolutely disgraceful, he shouted. Show some respect. But his words were drowned out by the laughter and chatter of the younger crowd members. The drunk man turned to address him directly. Mind your own business, old man. We're just having some fun with the tin soldier here. The veteran's eyes flashed with fury. That tin soldier has served his country with honor. He deserves better than this circus. James felt a moment of gratitude for the stranger's defense, but it also highlighted how helpless his position had become. He couldn't even acknowledge the support or defend himself against the insults. The drunk man seemed energized by the confrontation. He began marching back and forth in front of James, imitating military movements in an exaggerated and mocking way. With each step, he came closer to actually bumping into the guard. Look at me. I'm a fancy royal guard, he announced, saluting sloppily with his rubber chicken. The crowd's laughter reached a new peak, and the number of phones recording the scene had multiplied. James's breathing became more controlled and deliberate, a technique he'd learned in combat zones to maintain calm under pressure. But this was different from combat. In Afghanistan, he'd been able to respond to threats. Here, he was defenseless against an attack on his dignity and the honor of his position. The security guard spoke into his radio again, clearly calling for backup. But help seemed far away, and the situation was deteriorating rapidly. A new group of tourists had formed a semicircle around the scene, treating it like a street performance. Someone had even started taking bets on whether the guard would eventually react. £5 says he cracks in the next minute, a young woman called out, waving a banknote in the air. You're on, replied her friend. These guys are trained to be statues. He won't move. James felt his heart racing as he became the subject of gambling. The reduction of his service and sacrifice to entertainment value felt like a physical blow. Every breath became an effort, every second an eternity. The drunk man noticed the betting and decided to up his game. He began telling an elaborate story to his phone camera, narrating his brave encounter with the palace guard while continuing to wave the rubber chicken inches from James's nose. So there I was, face to face with one of the Queen's own guards, he slurred, his voice carrying across the courtyard. And I thought to myself, I bet I can make this guy laugh. He began doing an impromptu comedy routine, using the rubber chicken as a prop and James as his unwilling straight man. The crowd ate it up, with some people even throwing coins as if he were a street performer. A mother with young children finally had enough. Come on, kids, she said, pulling them away. This isn't appropriate. But her departure only made more room for others to press closer. The elderly veteran made another attempt to intervene. Young man, you need to stop this immediately. You're disgracing yourself and dishonoring these men who serve with pride. The drunk man turned on him aggressively. Nobody asked you, Grandpa. Go find somewhere else to be righteous. The confrontation between the two men created another layer of chaos, with the crowd now divided between those watching the guard harassment and those watching the argument between the veteran and the troublemaker. James felt completely isolated in the center of the storm. His fellow guards remained at their posts, following protocol, but he could see the concern in their peripheral expressions. They were all thinking the same thing: this had gone too far. The drunk man suddenly grabbed the rope barrier and lifted it, stepping into the clearly marked restricted area. "Let's get a really close-up shot," he announced, bringing his phone within inches of James's face. That's when James felt something snap inside him. Not his discipline, that held firm, but something deeper, a part of his spirit that had been worn down by months of increasing disrespect and humiliation. For the first time in his career, Sergeant James Morrison began to question whether the tradition he'd devoted his life to protecting was worth the cost to his personal dignity and mental health. The drunk man started making faces at the camera, using James's still form as a backdrop for his performance. Each gesture felt like another crack in the armor of James's resolve. In the distance, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridors of the castle. Someone was coming, though James couldn't know who. All he knew was that his breaking point was closer than it had ever been before, and something would have to give soon. The morning that had started like any other was rapidly becoming the most challenging day of his entire military and ceremonial career, with no end to the humiliation in sight. The drunk man had now positioned himself directly in front of James, his face barely 6 inches away from the guard's stoic expression. His breath reeked of alcohol and his bloodshot eyes showed no respect for the uniform or the man wearing it. "I wonder if they're programmed like robots," he said loudly to his audience, poking the air near James's chest with his rubber chicken. "Maybe if I find the right button, he'll start dancing." The crowd roared with laughter, and several more phones appeared to capture what everyone hoped would be the guard's breaking point. The betting had escalated, with multiple side wagers on exactly how the guard might react if he finally snapped. James felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. 23 years of service had prepared him for many things, but not for this level of public humiliation while being bound by protocol that prevented any response whatsoever. A young woman in the crowd shouted out a suggestion: "Try tickling him. That always works in the movies." The drunk man's eyes lit up with malicious glee. "Brilliant idea." He began wiggling his fingers theatrically near James's sides, pretending to tickle him while maintaining just enough distance to avoid actual physical contact. The elderly veteran who had tried to intervene earlier pushed forward again, his face purple with rage. "This has gone far enough. Someone needs to call the real security." "The real security?" the drunk man laughed. "This guy is the security. And he's about as useful as a scarecrow." He began doing an exaggerated impression of a scarecrow, flapping his arms and swaying dramatically. James's vision began to blur slightly at the edges. The combination of standing motionless for hours, the stress of the situation, and the rising anger in his chest was taking a physical toll. His legs felt like concrete pillars, but even concrete could crack under enough pressure. The civilian security guard had managed to call for backup, but the response was slow. The castle's security protocols were designed for serious threats, not for managing unruly tourists who technically weren't breaking any major laws. A group of university students had arrived with the latest tour bus, and they quickly sized up the situation. Instead of being appalled, they saw an opportunity for viral content. One of them pulled out a professional-looking camera and began filming from multiple angles. "This is going straight to TikTok," one of them announced. "Maybe we can get on the news." The prospect of even wider exposure made James's stomach turn. Bad enough that dozens of people were witnessing his humiliation in person, but the idea that millions might see it online made everything infinitely worse. The drunk man overheard the conversation about social media and became even more animated. "Make sure you get my good side," he called out, striking poses with his rubber chicken while using James as a prop. A middle-aged woman with a thick German accent pushed through the crowd with her family. "Vad is happening here? Why is everyone gathering?" "Some bloke's trying to make the guard crack," explained a British teenager. "He's been at it for ages. Pretty mental, really." The German woman looked confused. "But why would you want to make him crack?" The teenager shrugged. "For laughs, innit? These guards are supposed to be unbreakable. The exchange highlighted the international nature of the audience now watching James's ordeal. People from around the world were witnessing what they would likely remember as their primary impression of British royal tradition. James thought about the countless guards who had stood at these same posts over the centuries. They had protected kings and queens, witnessed history, and maintained dignity through wars and peace. Now that same uniform was being used as entertainment for strangers with cameras. The drunk man had discovered that pretending to have conversations with his rubber chicken while addressing James got the biggest laughs. He began an elaborate routine, speaking in different voices. "What's that, Mr. Chicken? You think the guard wants to be friends?" He held the toy up to his ear, pretending to listen. "Oh, you think he's just shy?" The crowd was eating it up, with some people actually applauding the impromptu performance. What had started as harassment had evolved into a full comedy show, with James as the unwilling and unpaid straight man. A tour guide with a new group tried to maintain some educational value. The Queen's Guard have a long and distinguished history dating back to. She began, but her words were completely drowned out by the laughter and chaos surrounding James. The drunk man noticed the tour guide and decided to incorporate her into his act. "Oh, look! The official lady wants to give us the boring history lesson. But we're making our own history today, aren't we, guard?" He leaned even closer to James, his face now so close that James could feel his breath. "Come on, just a little smile. Just a tiny one. I promise I won't tell anyone." James's jaw was clenched so tightly that he could hear his teeth grinding. The muscle in his cheek twitched involuntarily, the first visible sign that his composure was beginning to fracture under the pressure. Several people in the crowd noticed the twitch and pointed it out to others. "Did you see that? I think he's starting to break." The observation sent a wave of excitement through the crowd, like sharks sensing blood in the water. Everyone pressed closer, cameras at the ready to capture the exact moment when one of the Queen's Guards finally lost his composure. The drunk man sensed the shift in energy and pressed his advantage. He began making increasingly outrageous faces, sticking out his tongue and crossing his eyes while waving his rubber chicken like a flag of victory. "Come on, soldier boy. Just one little reaction. What's the worst that could happen?" What the drunk man didn't know was that James was asking himself the exact same question. After decades of faithful service, what would actually happen if he finally reached his limit? Would he lose his position? His pension? His honor? The answers to those questions seemed less important with each passing moment as his dignity was stripped away piece by piece in front of an audience that saw him not as a human being, but as an object to be manipulated for their amusement. James's breathing had become more labored, though he tried to hide it. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure the drunk man must be able to hear it. Every fiber of his being wanted to either flee or fight, but protocol demanded he do neither. The drunk man pulled out his phone again and began live streaming the scene. "Okay, everyone watching at home, we're trying to break one of the Queen's Guards. So far, no luck, but I think he's starting to crack." The knowledge that strangers around the world were now watching live made James feel even more trapped and exposed. There was no escape, no relief, and apparently no end to how far some people would go for entertainment. In the growing crowd, a small girl tugged on her mother's hand. "Mummy, why is that man being mean to the soldier?" Her mother looked uncomfortable. "I don't know, sweetie. Maybe we should go see something else." But they were hemmed in by the crowd, as trapped in the situation as James himself. The innocent question from the child cut through all the laughter and noise, highlighting what was really happening. A man was being tormented for sport, and everyone was watching. The drunk man was now taking requests from the crowd for what to do next, treating James like an interactive exhibit rather than a human being with feelings and dignity. As the morning sun climbed higher and the situation spiraled further out of control, none of them could have imagined that their chaotic scene was about to be interrupted by someone whose mere presence would change everything, someone who understood better than anyone the weight of duty and the importance of protecting those who serve with honor. The drunk man had reached a new level of boldness, encouraged by the crowd's enthusiastic response to his performance. He began conducting an impromptu interview with James, holding his phone like a microphone and speaking in an exaggerated television reporter voice. "So, Mr. Guard, how does it feel to be completely powerless while I do whatever I want?" he asked, thrusting the phone toward James's face. "Any thoughts on your taxpayer-funded career as a human statue?" The cruelty in his words cut deeper than any of his previous antics. James felt something fundamental shifting inside him, like a dam developing cracks under immense pressure. His vision tunneled slightly, focusing on the drunk man's mocking face while the crowd's laughter became a distant roar. A bead of sweat rolled down James's temple, visible to everyone. The crowd noticed immediately, interpreting it as a sign of his impending breakdown. The anticipation in the air was almost electric, with dozens of phones now recording from every possible angle. "Oh, he's sweating," someone called out. "The robot is overheating." The drunk man clapped his hands in delight. "That's it. We're getting through to him. What's next? Maybe some tears?" James closed his eyes for just a moment, another tiny break in protocol that felt like a massive defeat. In that darkness, he saw his daughter's face, his fellow soldiers who had died in Afghanistan, and all the values he'd spent his life defending. Was this really what his service had led to? When he opened his eyes, the drunk man was even closer, practically nose to nose with him. "I can see it in your eyes, mate. You want to hit me, don't you? You want to grab me and throw me across the courtyard." The accuracy of the observation was startling. James did want exactly that, and the drunk man seemed to sense it with predatory instinct. "But you can't, can you?" the man continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that only James could hear. "You're trapped in that silly uniform, playing dress-up for tourists while real men live their lives however they want." Those words hit like a physical blow. James felt his hands trembling almost imperceptibly, the final warning sign that his legendary control was about to shatter completely. The crowd had grown even larger, now numbering close to 100 people. Tour buses continued to arrive, disgorging more tourists who were drawn to the spectacle like moths to a flame. The castle's courtyard had become an amphitheater with James as the unwilling star of a degrading show. A group of teenagers had started a live commentary, describing the action like sports announcers. "The guard is definitely showing signs of stress now. His breathing has changed, and you can see the sweat building up." Their casual analysis of his suffering felt dehumanizing in the extreme. James had become a specimen to be studied and dissected for entertainment value. The drunk man sensed victory was near. He began his most aggressive performance yet, dancing around James in a circle while singing off-key songs and waving his rubber chicken like a conductor's baton. "Ring around the guard, why, pocket full of duty. Standing, standing, we all fall down." He collapsed dramatically at James's feet, then popped back up with exaggerated surprise. "Oh. Still there. How boring." Several people in the crowd were now actively cheering him on, treating the entire scene like a sporting event. Someone had even started a chant, "Make him move. Make him move." The elderly veteran made one final attempt to restore order. "This is absolutely shameful. Have you all lost your minds?" But his words were swept away in the tide of mob mentality that had taken hold. James felt completely alone despite being surrounded by 100 people. His fellow guards remained at their posts, following protocol, but their distance felt like abandonment. The security guards seemed overwhelmed and ineffective. The crowd had become a single organism focused on his destruction. The drunk man pulled out a small speaker and began playing loud, obnoxious music. "Let's see if we can get him to dance," he announced, beginning to gyrate obscenely in front of James while the crowd laughed and applauded. That's when James felt the final thread of his composure snap. 23 years of discipline and training crumbled in an instant. His right hand began to move toward his rifle, his body acting on pure instinct and rage. The crowd noticed the movement immediately. A collective gasp went up, followed by excited shouts. "He's moving! The guard is moving!" Cameras flashed and phones buzzed with notifications as the moment was captured and instantly shared across social media platforms. James Morrison, the soldier who had never broken protocol,
was about to become famous for all the wrong reasons.
His hand was halfway to his weapon when a clear, authoritative voice cut through the chaos like a knife.
What exactly is going on here?
The crowd turned as one to see Princess Charlotte approaching the scene, flanked by two of her personal protection officers. At 9 years old, she carried herself with the poise and authority that came naturally to someone born into royalty, but her young face showed genuine concern and confusion. The drunk man froze mid-dance, his rubber chicken still raised in the air.
The crowd's laughter died instantly, replaced by nervous shuffling and whispered conversations.
Phones slowly lowered as people realized they were in the presence of actual royalty. Princess Charlotte walked directly toward the center of the chaos, her protectors maintaining a discreet distance. She looked up at James with intelligent eyes that seemed far older than her years.
"Sergeant Morrison," she said, reading his name badge. "Are you all right?"
It was the first genuinely kind word James had heard in hours.
The simple question, asked with real concern by someone who understood the weight of duty, nearly broke him in an entirely different way.
James managed a barely perceptible nod, his training reasserting itself in the presence of the royal family member he was sworn to protect. But Princess Charlotte could see the strain in his eyes, the sweat on his brow, and the trembling in his hands that he was trying desperately to control. She turned to address the crowd, her young voice carrying surprising authority.
"I believe you're all standing too close to the guards.
They need space to do their important job of keeping everyone safe."
The drunk man, sobered by the presence of royalty, stammered an apology. We were having a bit of fun, Your Highness."
Princess Charlotte fixed him with a steady gaze. "Fun should never come at the expense of someone else's dignity," she replied with wisdom that belied her age.
"These men serve with honor. They deserve respect, not mockery." The crowd began to disperse, shame replacing entertainment as people realized how their behavior must look to actual royalty.
The drunk man slipped away quietly, his rubber chicken forgotten on the cobblestones. But Princess Charlotte wasn't finished. She had witnessed enough to understand that something significant had almost happened, and she was determined to address it properly. The intervention of a 9-year-old princess had just prevented what could have been a career-ending moment for a devoted soldier, but the real resolution was still to come. Princess Charlotte stood in the center of the now quiet courtyard, her presence having transformed the chaotic scene into something resembling respectful order.
The remaining tourists kept their distance, many looking ashamed of their earlier behavior.
She approached James directly, ignoring protocol in the way that only royalty could. "Sergeant Morrison, I saw what was happening from the window upstairs.
That man was being very unkind to you."
James felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes.
After hours of dehumanizing treatment, the simple acknowledgement of his suffering from this young princess felt like a healing balm.
He managed a slight clearing of his throat but remained at attention.
"Would you like to sit down for a moment?" she asked gently.
"I think you've been standing for a very long time."
One of her protection officers stepped forward.
"Your Highness, perhaps we should." Princess Charlotte held up a small hand.
"Please. This is important."
She turned back to James, her young face serious and determined.
"My grandmother always told me that the people who serve our family are not decorations or entertainment.
They're real people with families and feelings who chose to dedicate their lives to something bigger than themselves." James felt his rigid posture softening slightly despite his training. The princess's words carried the weight of genuine understanding that none of the tourists had shown.
"I want to apologize to you," she continued, her voice clear and sincere.
"Not just for that rude man, but for all the people who forgot that you're a human being deserving of respect." The elderly veteran who had tried to defend James earlier stepped forward, removing his cap.
"Your Highness, if I may say so, your words do honor to your family and to all who serve."
Princess Charlotte acknowledged him with a gracious nod, then returned her attention to James.
"Sergeant Morrison, would you be able to tell me about your service? I'd like to learn about the real person behind the uniform."
For the first time in years, James was being asked about himself as an individual rather than being treated as a living statue. The question caught him off guard, and he had to think carefully about how to respond while maintaining proper protocol. Your Highness, he said quietly, I've served for 23 years, including deployment in Afghanistan before joining the ceremonial guard.
I have a daughter about your age. Princess Charlotte's face brightened with interest. What's her name? Emily, Your Highness. Emily is a lovely name.
I bet she's very proud of her father.
James felt his chest tighten with emotion.
I hope so, Your Highness. Though sometimes I wonder if she truly understands why I do this job.
Princess Charlotte considered this seriously. I think children understand more than adults sometimes give them credit for.
Emily probably knows that her father is brave and honorable, even if she can't put it into words yet. A small crowd of tourists had begun to gather again, but this time they maintained a respectful distance. They seemed to understand that they were witnessing something significant, a moment of genuine human connection between royalty and the people who serve them.
Sergeant Morrison, Princess Charlotte said thoughtfully, would you mind if I asked my protection officer to take your place for a few minutes? I think you could use a short break. James was stunned.
Royal family members didn't typically concern themselves with the welfare of individual guards, and certainly not to the extent of arranging relief for them.
Your Highness, that's very kind, but it's not necessary.